Hey everybody, in this video we're going to take a look at another short Latin story. Now this one's called The First Wooden Leg, and it's an interesting story about ancient Greece that comes from George L. Bennett's Easy Latin Stories for Beginners. Now if you've used any of the videos in this series before, you've heard me talk about Bennett. And tell you that what he's calling easy Latin stories are not necessarily easy, and they're also not necessarily for beginners. Okay, so it's interesting that he would think of them this way. They're not the hardest stories you've ever seen. They're not particularly long, but I would say they're probably best for sort of that Latin 2 or 3 range. If you studied Latin for maybe 2 or 3 years, somewhere in there, just because the grammar that he uses is, it tends to be grammar, things like subjunctive that you just don't normally see in that beginner Latin 1 curriculum. So there's a few things in that might be a little bit tricky, but if you want more information about them or want to see more of these stories, they're all there on my website. You can take a look. I believe I've put translations for them that were sort of open access, so you can take a look and compare your translation against something else. But it's always there for you. I really like Bennett because he dives into mythology sometimes, stories that have sort of a moral, almost like a parable, and a lot of them do touch on sort of Greek culture, ancient Greek or Roman culture, which is just a great way to expose your students, or if you are a student, to be exposed to different things that don't show up in a traditional Latin textbook. Okay, so I would always say these are a great break if you've been, focusing on one particular textbook. Maybe you're getting either a little bored with it, or you're just doing a lot of repetitive things. Take a look at one of these stories, right? Break out for a second, learn something new, and see if you can handle it. It's always a good break to do. So that's where I usually use them. Like I said, somewhere in Latin 2 or 3, they're just a great little break. Now, before we dive into the story, the first thing I'd always tell you to do is read the story aloud, right? So if you can find a classmate, someone you can read this story to, and then have them read it back to you, that way you can work on your speaking and your pronunciation when you're reading, and you're listening when your partner's reading. These are really great skills. You never want to shut off those parts of your brain. Whenever you're trying to learn a language. So bring it to life, right? Speak it, listen to it. These are great things to always do. So I'll start the video by reading it to you. Not that my pronunciation is anything fantastic, but just in case you don't have anyone who can read it to you, this will be an opportunity to hear the story. The other thing that I always recommend you do is do a little pre-reading, right? So look at the story. You don't necessarily have to try to translate it, but just look at the words and see if there's any you don't know. If there's if there's vocabulary you're not sure of, that's kind of an easy fix. There's a lot of good resources online, or any dictionary, honestly, will help you. But try to make a list of vocab, maybe words you're not sure of. Put it into a Quizlet, something like that, and practice it, because it's really hard to understand what's going on if you just don't know what the words mean, right? And for these old textbooks, we're talking 1879 here, you're not really going to find a vocab list. So if you can make one on your own, perfect, right? That way you at least know what's going on, okay? The last thing I tell you to do is when the time comes to actually translate, right? If you want to make sure that you're doing it really well, try the read and reread method. You hear me say this a lot, but it works. You want to read through the entire story, write down on a list, paper, whatever, any problem areas that you might have. And then when you're done with that first read, take a look at your list and try to figure out where you went wrong. If it's vocab, that's really easy. Just look it up. If it's grammar, that might be a little bit harder, but try to see if you can understand where you went wrong. Okay, then you go back and you repeat that process over and over again, and the list should get shorter and shorter and shorter until you're able to read through this entire story without any problem. You don't need to write anything down. That's how you know that you understood it, and you're probably ready to move on. Now, this story has to do, like I said, with a wooden leg, and it's really talking about a particular Greek you're going to see who cuts off his own foot, right, and replaces it with a wooden one, right, this wooden leg or wooden foot. So it's a really interesting story, but it does come from Herodotus. I believe it's from his histories, and it's referencing, I believe, a real person from the wars between ancient Greece and Persia, okay? So you're going to see a little bit about the Spartans in there, but this really is a specifically Greek story. But I think this is a good one for sort of a launch pad into talking about, maybe a little bit about Greek medicine or different ways that they would make prosthetics, which we've seen, right? You can look these up. There are a few that we have. So again, it's just an interesting story to dive into and give you something to think about. Okay, so let's start by reading it together, and then we'll translate it. So the story goes like this. You start with this. You have erat olim, hegestratus quidam, quem Spartani in vincula conjecerat. Ille vero hac calamitate circumventus non modo capitis imminente poena, sed ante mortem etiam multos expectans dolores. Facinus commissit dictu incredibile. Feream forte instrumentum nactus partem peris sibi abscidit. Quo facto, per fosso, pariete e carcere effugit. noctu iter faciens, inter dio vero inter fruticeta latens. Audacia homines stupefacti sunt Spartani, qui videbant ab scissum pedem humi acentem, hominem autem reperiri non poterant. Ille vero sanato vulnere, ligneum pedem sibi abscivit. Okay, so let's pause the video there. Okay, you can hear I'm having a cold, so this is not great for pronunciation, but still, it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Hopefully, if you don't have anyone who you can read it with, right, at least you get to hear the story once. But let's pause the video there. And if you haven't done everything I mentioned before, go back, look it up, try to translate it, work it through on your own. And now let's take a look together and kind of unpack it, okay? So the first line goes like this. You have erat olim, right? So you have this idea of once upon a time, okay, right? Olim. So once there was a certain Hegestratus, okay? Now this is a real person, we believe, right, from Herodotus' histories. So there's a certain Hegestratus whom the Spartans, Spartani, in vincula coniacerat, right? The Spartans had thrown into chains, right? So he was captured, and was a prisoner of the Spartans, okay? Then you have Ilewera, right? So he truly, right? He indeed, having been involved in this calamity, misfortune, right? So hac calamitate circumventus, right? So kind of with this happening to him is the idea of this calamity, right? He's thrown in jail. Not only non modo, with the poena imminente, right? The imminent punishment or penalty of death, right? So this poena capitis, right? The punishment of your head, is referring to execution, right? They're going to kill him. Okay, so not only is he facing basically the death penalty, but also sedante mortem etiam, right? But also before death, he's facing many tortures, right? Multos dolores, so many tortures. And then the expectans is your present participle, so expecting. So it's saying not only with the imminent penalty of death, but also expecting many tortures before death, right? Ante mortem. So he's expecting he's going to be tortured by the Spartans, and this is not going to go well, right? So what does he do? Commissit facinus, he committed a deed, right? Miraculous to tell, dictu incredibile, right? So this miraculous deed that we're going to learn about right now, this facinus, okay? So what did he do? Well, he did this, okay? So the next line is ferreum, right? So something to do with iron, right? So you have ferreum forte instrumentum noctus. So having by chance found, right? Having found forte by chance a iron instrument, an instrumentum ferreum, right? So something made out of iron. Think of like a knife almost, but probably not a knife, but something metal. So having found this by chance, he cut off, absceded, right? He cut off part of his own foot, right? Partem pedis sibi, right? So he cut his foot off. So this has sort of strong vibes to the movie Saw back in the day, right? The idea of cutting your own foot off when you're in prison, right? But pretty drastic move. But I guess he figures he's facing the death penalty, so that's what he's going to do, right? So he cuts his foot off. Then you have quo facto. So having done this, right, and having dug through the wall, per fosso pariete e carcere fugit, right? So having dug through the wall, he escaped, fugit, from the prison. So he cuts his foot off, he breaks a hole through the wall, and now he's out, kind of limping as he goes without a foot. So then you have noctu iter facien, so traveling at night, right? Noctu, at night, and interdiu, during the day, lying latens, right? Vero inter fruticeta, so lying hidden among the thickets, right? The fruticeta are like the bushes almost, during the day. So again, he travels at night, and during the day he's hiding out in the bushes, right? You'd think they'd follow the blood trail, but whatever, he's able to hide. Okay. Then you have audacia homines stupefacti sunt Spartani. So the Spartans are stunned, right? They were stunned by this. Stupefacti sunt, right? Stupefied is kind of the word you get in English. So they're shocked by this, like what just happened? And they're shocked by the boldness of this man, right? So audacia homines. So the Spartans are shocked by this, and it's this man who it's the Spartans are shocked, and it's the Spartans who saw videbant, right? Qui videbant, they saw the foot having been cut off, the abscisum pedem, the cut off foot, iacentem, lying, right? Just a present participle, lying on the ground, humi, right? So in other words, they're shocked because they walk into the jail, they see the hole in the wall, and they see a foot sitting there, and they realize what this nut did, right? Cutting his own foot off. Okay. Then you have hominem autem reperire non poterant. So, but they were not able to find the man, right? The hominem. So they find the foot, but they don't know where the man is. So they're absolutely shocked at what happened here, right? So he makes his escape. Then you have the last line. You have ille veros sanato vulnere, right? So, but he, right, this man, ille sanato vulnere, you could almost say like when his wound was healed, right? You have the ablative absolute, right, with his wound having been healed. But when his wound was healed, meaning his foot, I guess healed up. I don't know how it would heal up if you cut your foot off, but sure. So when it finally healed, he made a wooden foot for himself, right? So you have here the askiwit, right? It's sort of like adopted is kind of one way to translate it, but it probably makes more sense to say he made. So he adopted or made a ligneum pedem, a wooden foot or a wooden leg, depending on how you want to view this, for himself. Right. So when he's done, he introduces the first prosthetic. Right. It's kind of the idea. That's why this story is called The First Wooden Leg. So the image that I put here is actually kind of an interesting one. So I am not an expert, but if you've ever kind of taken a look at ancient medicine and their practices, it's actually really interesting to see what they could do, what they attempted, different things like that. But we do have evidence of prosthetic limbs. So this one is called the Capua leg, right? Because of where it was discovered. And it really is that, right? It's one of the earliest, I believe, one of the earliest prosthetic limbs that we found. But there's other evidence of prosthetics in the ancient world, right? There's a bunch of them out there. Ancient Egypt, I think you can find a wooden foot, if I remember right. So if you're interested in this stuff, I'd highly recommend that you take a look. This story can be kind of a good launching point for you to go and explore that world. It's really fascinating. You'd have to do some digging on your own. I would not be an expert, so I couldn't really point you into any great direction. But I'm sure if you do some digging, you'll see that there are prosthetics out there. And it just shows you, right? We sometimes think of the ancient world as not having all this stuff, which is not true. They had some really, really great stuff, really advanced stuff. And so I think this story is kind of an interesting launch point to see that. But on its own, the story is pretty good. Like I said, it's just a fun story about someone facing death, and what would you do in that situation, right? So Hegestratus, this is his famous moment of cutting his own leg off. And like I said, if you've seen that movie Saw, that's kind of what it always reminds me of. But it's a good little story to read. Not too difficult. But if you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. I'm happy to help and explain, explain any of the translation or anything to you. But otherwise, use it as just another way to break free of a traditional textbook, right? Read something different and have some fun. Good luck.